Hopefully we will have this available to our membership on the TWS website. I wanted to take a moment just to introduce Michael. Michael is a certified wildlife biologist and professional wetland scientist and co-founder, co-owner, and principal scientist of Edgewood Environmental Consulting, LLC, which is an ecological survey, impact assessment, and permitting consultancy. Mr. Fishman's consulting work has spanned more than 30 US states and 4 countries, focusing mostly on rare species, especially bats and birds, and wetlands work, but also including international biodiversity survey and ecosystem impact assessment of land use, as well as environmental permitting. He has worked with renewable energy, oil and gas, mining, port development, municipal infrastructure, as well as residential, commercial, and industrial development clients who develop sustainable land use plans and to protect and enhance natural and cultural resources. Again, today he's going to be talking to us about solar ecosystem enhancement planning. I welcome everybody to introduce yourselves in the chat box. Feel free to go ahead and put your questions in there as well if you would like, and feel free to be interactive on that chat box as much as we can be. So Michael, at this point, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. We figured we've got about 40 minutes for the presentation, and then we'd have about 20 minutes for Q&A if that's okay with you.
That sounds great. Thank you very much, Susan. Appreciate it. Okay, to jump right in, hopefully you can see my screen. I am here to talk about a project that I've been working on with a team of very, very talented people over about the past year. And we started working on this project with EDPR, which is a renewable energy development company. The project was led by Working Lands Investment Partners, and a number of other players were involved, which I'll get to in the presentation. But first, we'll set the background a little bit and get into what it was we actually did. So I think, as everybody here probably recognizes, solar energy has been growing, solar energy development has been growing at an unprecedented rate over about the past 10 years. This chart and the next few charts I'm going to show are from the Solar Energy Industry Association and Wood Mackenzie's Power and Renewables US Solar Market Insight 2021 Year in Review Report. And these show just the trends going on in the United States and in some cases in North America on solar growth. And it's been growing at an amazing rate, and there's a number of reasons behind that, but all sectors of the industry are growing rapidly, including residential, commercial, and utility solar. And solar isn't only growing in and of itself, but it is also becoming a growing percentage of total energy production among all sectors, filling in for decreases in some other energy forms, mostly probably coal, but also some declines in the use of oil, and gas hasn't been declining that much, but oil and gas are declining somewhat. Solar development growth is also happening on a broad geographic range. It's very strong in the northeastern US, led by New York and Massachusetts primarily. But Minnesota and the upper Northwest is also seeing solar development expand at just an amazing rate. Furthermore, predictions for further growth of solar extending out 5 years show that the trend is likely to continue on the long term. So what's driving this growth? Regulatory requirements for clean air, a basic human desire for cleaner energy generation solutions, and increasing concerns about human-generated climate change impacts are probably two of the strongest need-based drivers, along with people's just general insatiable appetite to have more energy. We are a very oil-addicted species. We rely on it to power our cars, to move our goods, heat our homes, generate electricity, keep the machinery of our industries running. But with increasing costs and unpredictable or uncontrollable sources of oil, especially what we've been experiencing over about the past month, and a strong push to replace internal combustion cars with electric vehicles, we still need energy, but we're needing to look to alternative sources to oil. And by the way, I took this shot of this gas pump just a couple of days ago. And if you can see on the gas pump, the little price there, somebody before me took $5 worth of gas for their car. And I can remember when I first started driving, $5 would fill my mother's Toyota Corolla gas tank about half full. This person got 1.1 gallon. Another driver for solar growth has been the decreasing cost of solar technology. That comes with both innovations in the technology itself, but also increasing numbers of providers and the increasing demand. It'll be interesting to see when the increasing demand meets the limitations of supply, but at the moment it hasn't, and costs have decreased pretty dramatically over the past 10 years, but seem to be leveling out. Regardless of the reasons, however, solar development is here and it's here to stay. And we're seeing more and more solar arrays popping up across the landscape. And as with anything that starts popping up across the landscape, we ecologists and biologists start looking at the potential impact this may have to habitat continuity, habitat quality, quantity, and generally how changing the landscape may affect the natural world and our relationship with it. Solar energy development offers a lot of benefits in replacing carbon-emitting energy sources and helping to preserve and restore clean air. One producer with whom I've worked used to quote that about a 2 megawatt solar array on 15 acres of land could offset the emissions of about 200 cars. That's a pretty powerful statistic if it's true. But however, site selection for some solar facilities requires clearing large areas of vegetation, including trees, which displaces carbon sinks. So there's an impact end of this equation as well, not just the benefit. So it also fragments forests, it fragments forest canopies, it fragments habitats, it creates barriers to wildlife movement, as well as impacting soils, water cycles, and other biotic and abiotic environmental elements. So some solar siting aims to prevent those impacts by using either previously disturbed sites or sites that are not naturally vegetated, like farmland. Farmland use still has impacts to things like prime soils and agricultural productivity. So agricultural communities and state departments of agriculture and markets are getting involved in solar development discussion for that reason and are starting to regulate solar development. Solar development is an excellent use of things like brownfields, reclaimed mines, rooftops, parking lots, but there are not enough of those sites near interconnection points to meet the current or projected demand for solar development growth. One of the big concerns with solar development is loss of habitat. No other form of energy requires the area of real estate per megawatt of energy production or generation. So early arrays in the West and in desert areas were often left barren beneath the panels or had mowed grass, turf grass, which does stabilize soils and it has some cooling and water retention effect on the soil. So those are benefits, but they offer little else from the standpoint of wildlife habitat or other benefits. As solar arrays have evolved though, developers recognize that they could at least create early successional plant communities through plantings. Early successional communities are important to a wide variety of small mammals, reptiles, insects, but unfortunately, grassland birds, which are in need of such habitats, especially with declining, many of them being declining, they tend not to use solar arrays, probably due to the physical obstruction of the panels. So management recommendations for solar arrays have come to rely on one battle cry, and that's pollinators. Pollinator plantings are currently and increasingly recommended as the cure-all for this problem of habitat loss to legitimize simple planting schemes. But as H.L. Mencken once stated, for every difficult problem, there is a solution that is simple, neat, and wrong. That may be a bit harsh. Pollinators are important, and we should be providing habitat for them where we can. But the problem is broader than that, and it requires a broader solution. We need to turn our focus from individual species or species assemblages like pollinators to a broader array. See what I did there? Array a broader array of receptors. We should be looking at the problem of solar array siting on an ecosystem scale, because solar arrays change whole ecosystems. When they change ecosystems, they change the reason we value ecosystems, which is ecosystem services. So what are ecosystem services? Well, a generally accepted definition of ecosystem services is the many and varied benefits to humans provided by healthy ecosystems in a natural environment. I don't really like this definition. I pulled this definition off the internet, of course, but I would say that I would strike a few terms out of this. The first one would be to humans. Ecosystems provide benefits to a lot of different animals and organisms, not just to humans. So I don't want to limit it that way. I would also strike out the word healthy, because unhealthy ecosystems can still provide value, still provide services. And I would also strike in a natural environment, because ecosystems aren't restricted to natural environments. Ecosystems can exist in built environments. But once we've edited this to the many and varied benefits provided by ecosystems, it's a very simple statement. And for those of you who were working actively in the 90s and might remember, ecosystem services are what used to be called functions and values. Back in those days, we used to assess the functions and values of wetlands, and those functions and values are now called ecosystem services. So ecosystem services were primarily defined when they changed the name to ecosystem services by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was a UN-led project in 2001 through 2005, in which they wanted to assess ecosystems worldwide. There's a long list of ecosystem services that they dealt with, and rather than go through all of them, we'll just review the categories under which they were organized, which provides a reasonable idea of what the actual services can be. So the Millennium Assessment organized services into 4 categories. There were provisioning services, which, as they suggest, provide needed resources, things like food and water and any other resources that were required by the organisms within an ecosystem. Then there were regulating services, which stabilize or moderate processes. An example of a regulating service would be erosion control of rooted plants on a slope, something you see failing in the picture, the second picture on the top. The third category is cultural services. This recognizes the value to humans part of the definition. But cultural services can include recreational resources, but they can also include things like spiritual or religious resources, places of significance or resources of significance to people for personal or religious reasons. And finally, supporting services. And supporting services are things that support processes or functions. For example, the water cycle can be supported by trees, which help to, or vegetation in general, which transpires water from the soil into the air. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Framework provides a very useful tool by which we can measure potential impact and benefits of solar development, as well as prescriptions for solar site management that we may suggest for ecosystem services improvements on solar sites. And this was kind of the basis of the tool that we developed. Now, I'll start out by saying that this was not necessarily an original idea. There was a very similar tool and product developed in Europe by Alana Armstrong and several other people in Great Britain, called the Solar Park Impacts on Ecosystem Services Project. The acronym for that is SPIES, which is a way cooler acronym than we have. But the limitation of this project was that the literature on which it was based was largely Eurocentric, and therefore some of the things didn't necessarily apply here in North America. And we wanted to have a similar tool, but had to do a little bit of further research in order to be able to focus it more strongly on North American ecosystems rather than European ecosystems. And so we came to develop the Solar Ecosystem Enhancement Tool, or SEET. As I mentioned earlier, the lead organization in this project was the Working Lands Investment Partners. and participants included the Restoration Science Center at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, go Okies, the Habitat by Design consulting organization led by Jeff Keller, Empire Environmental Partners and Charlotte Brett, US Forest Capital and Sumco Eco Contracting, who are basically ecosystem evaluators, if you will. They kind of cross the line between ecosystems and economics. And Edgewood Environmental Consulting, which is our firm. Basically, the product, the team was interdisciplinary and included ecologists, economists, foresters, restoration specialists. So it was a really terrific team. We also included among that team staff from EDPR, which is the development company, the solar development company. So we had an industry ear, if you will, and industry review of the product as we went along, and that did make some adjustments. But what we basically started with was we developed an annotated bibliography of literature on land prescriptions that could be used in early successional stage sites that would provide documentable ecosystem services and could be potentially practiced within the fence of a solar array. We then took that annotated bibliography and we developed an interactive menu matrix. And I think that the person that actually did a lot of that work is on this call. Hi, Maddie Lairs. We developed the interactive menu matrix, which was basically two worksheets in an Excel workbook, one of which was a menu list of prescriptions, and the other was the matrix of numbered bibliographic annotations, so that you could click on the prescription itself, locate what ecosystem service that prescription would affect. If you clicked on that ecosystem service column, it would take you right to the annotated bibliography and the reference that supported that prescription. I hope I said that right. And so it identified solar ecosystem management prescriptions, is the simple way of putting all of that were literature supported. We then developed a series of tiered ecosystem services goals, depending on the nature of the particular solar site that had been selected. And what I mean by that is, was it a brownfield site? Was it a paved site? Was it a desert site? Was it a farm site? Was it a forested site? Because that really spoke to the availability of natural resources that were there and what could be done. Also, the array of ecosystem services that the site might provide in its pre-construction form versus what it could provide in its post-construction form. So the tiered system looked a little bit like this. Tier 1 were sites that were going to end up being at least minimally impacted by their ecosystem services would be minimally impacted. That is to say, they might not support very strong ecosystem services in the first place. So these were things like desertified sites, mineland sites, brownfields, where there might not be a lot of natural infrastructure there to begin with. There might not be a lot of strong ecosystem services to begin with. And the purpose of doing the prescriptions was primarily to stabilize the site, possibly add a few ecosystem services if we could, but to mostly just minimize the impacts as best we could. Tier 2 would be sites that might have some more natural resources associated with them, but perhaps maybe not either protected or rare species or protected or rare habitat elements. And our goal there was to maintain or restore ecosystem services, or in some cases replace ecosystem services that might be lost, so that there would be a good balance between the before and after condition of the site. And finally, tier 3 was to be maintained, restored, or enhanced in its ecosystem services. And these were the more environmentally sensitive sites, sites that might have, for example, rare, threatened, or endangered species, or might have protected wetlands on them, so that they were sites where we didn't want to lose those natural resources and the values that they provided, or the services that they provided. So we wanted to make a stronger effort to manage those sites to restore, maintain, or enhance some of those to have a net gain in the end. And again, this all depended on site conditions, also on regulatory requirements. Regulatory requirements are becoming a stronger and stronger driver in these types of requirements, but also in solar development in general. Host communities are becoming a very strong driver because host communities want to see benefits that extend beyond payment in lieu of taxes and in things like that. So they're looking for an ecological payback in some cases because they have to be looking at these arrays and they have to live with the arrays, so they want something in return. So we established basically a flow, a workflow. And it started out like this. This is going to be a fairly large flow chart, so bear with me and we'll walk through it. But we started with one of two types of sites. You either had natural cover type on the site or no natural cover type. And we would take those sites and we would assess the existing ecosystem services and impacts to establish baseline conditions. Basically, we're just establishing what are the ecosystem service values of this site in its undeveloped form. For a site without natural cover, the first question we had to ask was, well, could a natural cover type be created? Could we plant the site, for example? Was it a farmed site? And could we plant a native seed mix, for example? If we couldn't, things like parking lots, rooftops, some wastewater treatment plants, landfills, hardscapes, those are places we can minimally manipulate. Then we could use SEET and SEET being the Solar Ecosystem Enhancement Tool, that interactive matrix. We could use SEET to develop recommendations for prescriptions that would at least minimize the impacts to ecosystem services on those sites. So they would be minimally impacted, but they would still provide some measure of ecosystem services. It may be a net loss in the end, but they weren't very strong in their ecosystem services to begin with. On natural cover sites, we would then go on to ask whether there were protected resources present, things like protected wetlands and rare, threatened, and endangered species. In some cases, cultural resources should also be considered as well, because cultural resources are an ecosystem benefit or can provide an ecosystem benefit. So if there were no resources present, and if we could create ecosystem services on a non-natural cover type site, the next question was, what features could maintain or restore ecosystem services? Again, that's the tier 2 goal, is to maintain and restore the ecosystem services. So again, we applied the SEET tool, developed prescriptions, things like plantings. They could be something as simple as wildlife structures, nesting structures, perching structures, adding soil amendments or plantings, creating gardens or trails for cultural benefits. Those are all possible prescriptions and examples of some of the prescriptions we could make. And that yielded a tier 2 maintained or restored ecosystem service site. Finally, if there were protected resources on a site, of course, we went through the sequencing of avoiding and minimizing the impacts on those resources as best we could, and then started to consider mitigation and also enhancement of ecosystem services on the site. So that was basically asking the question, what features could restore, maintain, or enhance the ecosystem services? Again, we plugged in the SEET and came up with habitat restoration or creation, long-term monitoring, T&E species conservation easements, generally more intense projects that could be done on the site, generally probably more expensive ones, but also the ones that yielded a greater ecosystem services benefit. And those were the tier 3 sites. The tier 3 sites were maintained, restored, and enhanced ecosystem services sites. So this is a very kind of simplified diagram of the process that we went through for each of the sites that we looked at. We also conducted a very simple benefit versus cost analysis for each of these. Ecosystem service benefits were simply rated by a number of suns. So it was 1 sun to 3 suns, 1 sun being minor benefits, 3 suns being major benefits, or a lot of ecosystem service benefits. This was based on primarily professional judgment, based on what we felt. We assigned sort of informed weighting to each of the ecosystem services that were provided to say which ones were most important. And again, that was on a site-by-site basis because some ecosystem services are more significant in some places than they are in others. We also looked at financial costs, and again, these were general estimates of cost, and those were rated by dollar signs, which seemed to be the sensible symbol. And I should note the ecosystem benefits originally, when we rated them in our reports, were rated with smiling suns, but I couldn't find a smiling sun icon for this presentation. But financial costs were rated in $1 to $3 signs. Heavier lift projects obviously had $3 signs. Simple projects had $1 sign, just to give the land manager some notion of what they were up to and how much budget they would have to commit to projects like this. And after doing this, all this process and selection, we then basically wrote up our recommendations in what we called our Solar Ecosystem Enhancement Plans, or SEEPs. And these were very simple plans, pretty much. They included our baseline assessment, the SEET prescriptions, and a definition of what they were, where they could be done on the site. They included maps, the benefit cost analysis to give the operators, again, some idea of what they were going to be doing and the kind of return they would get on their dollars, a maintenance plan, and a monitoring plan to create a feedback loop for comprehensive management, so that you could look at, were all of the prescriptions that we recommended succeeding? If they were succeeding, great. If they weren't succeeding, what adaptations needed to be made so that they would work? They could include tier 1, 2, or 3 options. And again, they depended on the regulatory needs, the community desires, and the available budget. So we spent, like I said, about a year developing this product with EDPR. EDPR, then we looked at 3 different sites, one in Ohio, one in Indiana, and one in Oregon in the high desert region. Really interesting projects. Unfortunately, the one in Oregon ended up not being built, but I believe the ones in Ohio and Indiana will be built, and hopefully they will be incorporating these plans. But that's not the end of the story. We towards the end of last year, we started working on SEET Mark II, which was basically trying to make the project a little bit, or I should say, not as company specific. It wasn't addressed to the specific developer, but would now be addressed to all developers, and to be a bit more project generic, so that we could apply it more broadly in more geographic areas and more ecosystem conditions than just the 3 sites we had looked at with EDPR. And so we've been in the process of doing that scrubbing, and recently have come up with an opportunity for some funding, some federal funding, to pursue what we hope will be SEET and SEET Mark III. And for these, or for this next iteration, we're hoping to add some site selection criteria to help improve site selection for solar sites. Site selection is always a challenging thing. There are a lot of limitations for selecting solar sites, not the least of which is how close can you connect to, or how closely can you interconnect to the local grid? That's a major limiting factor. No developer wants to have to lay wire to connect to an interconnect point that's far away from their site. Wire doesn't make money, it costs money. So again, we have to work with, in a realistic world, we have to work with the developers to make sure that we're working within what are their reasonable constraints, and cost is a big one. So how do you find a site that's near an interconnect point, or a potential interconnect point, that isn't either a rare cover type or a mature forested site, which is of course taking out forest, breaking forest canopy, breaking habitats, but also removing a significant carbon sink to create something that's supposed to offset carbon in the first place. So we want to try to improve site selection if we can, as part of the process, selecting better sites. Another thing we are looking to develop over the next year, we hope, year to 2 years, is ecosystems, developing an ecosystem services rapid assessment method. Assessing ecosystem services can be a fairly complicated process. There are so many different services, they reach into so many different fields, but we're looking to do this in probably a qualitative manner. There's an old method of assessing wetland functions and values called the highway methodology, which was basically just a series of questions that you answered for each of the different functions or values of wetlands to determine whether or not a particular wetland exhibited that function or value. That's the kind of thing we'll probably work with, but we're open to suggestions and ideas, of course. Ideally, regulatory agencies like to see things that are quantified if we can, and that's a qualitative assessment method. So we're going to have to balance that somehow. So there are some challenges ahead with that, but I think it would be a useful tool both for collecting baseline data and also the monitoring data post-construction for comparison. We would like to develop a list of criteria for development of more site prescriptions. In other words, what criteria does each prescription have to meet in order for it to qualify to show that it provides an ecosystem service? So it should be supported by literature. That's certainly one good, strong criteria. We'd like to have science-backed prescriptions, but there are other criteria that will apply, having to do with social acceptance, regulatory acceptance, and financial practicability. And finally, we would like to develop additional site prescriptions. There are a lot more to go. We have a list of, I think there were 65 or thereabouts prescriptions that were available in our menu. We'd like to develop more, as many as we can. And those can be developed on a regionally specific basis if necessary. And they should also include things like allowing for construction of solar sites in agricultural communities where agriculture may in fact be a reasonable use between panels. That's a growing activity in the solar market, is that they're basically agro-solar fields. So we've got some work cut out for us ahead. I did keep this to 40 minutes. I kept it to, it looks like 30 minutes or 35 minutes. And at this point, I'm more than happy to take questions and discuss.
Thanks, Michael. This is fascinating. I can't wait to get a copy of all this stuff from you. We've got about 24 people on the line. So I'm just going to allow everybody to sort of raise your hands and ask questions individually. If you go down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see there's a reactions icon down there. And if you click that, there's a raise hands button. So if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll call you out individually and give you a chance to talk to Michael. Karen Swain, go ahead and ask your question.
Michael, thanks. Yeah, very informative. I'm particularly interested in knowing if you're finding that agrivoltaics and pollinating, adding pollinators are really popular and kind of being promoted as the best thing since sliced bread in your area.
Pollinators are certainly one of the biggest recommendations we're seeing across the board. And the problem is that I think everybody sees that as a cure-all. And one of the issues that we discussed and tried to address in these plans and with the tool was, in reality, you can plant a native pollinator-oriented field and be only benefiting really 2 species of pollinators. And where that pollinator field is located is important to consider. For example, we looked at 2 sites that were in agricultural communities, and pollinators are certainly important to agricultural communities, but just as important are things like crop pest predators. And so you could do plantings that encourage crop pest predators instead, and that way you're helping to control the local crop pests in a non-chemical way. So there are alternatives to just your basic pollinator field. The other issue with pollinators and pollinator fields is, generally the instruction is, well, use a native seed mix. Well, what's a native seed mix? Is it native to North America? Is it native to the United States? Is it native to the state that you're in, or is it native to the county that you're in? And what's the seed source? Where did the seeds come from? There aren't native seed propagators in every state of the United States or every Canadian province. There aren't seed producers in every county. So you may be getting seeds that could be from half a country away that aren't local genetic stock, that aren't locally adapted, and may not be preferred by the native insects. So when we were preparing plans for EDPR, we tried to narrow it down at least regionally to say that your seed source had to come from within a 5-state area surrounding your site to at least keep them as local as that. And that's probably not even local enough. But at least it's getting closer. And again, you're going to find some regions of the country where they just don't have native seed suppliers. So they're going to go to a seed supplier that's somewhere else far, far away, and they're going to bring in non-local seed of a native species that isn't really native to the area. It's not indigenous. So that's going to cause problems. And so we're hoping to solve that problem, and I won't say do away with the Band-Aid approach, but come up with a better Band-Aid. Does that help?
Katie, do you have a question?
Yes, hi. Thank you so much. I'm Katie Wynn with West Inc. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of the SEET prescriptions.
Okay, prescriptions could vary pretty widely, and they're really kind of any land management recommendation you could make that would provide an ecosystem benefit. So there could be things as simple as maintaining naturally vegetated buffers on wetlands. We had one site that had a small stream that ran through it. And so we said, well, we want to maintain a naturally vegetated buffer around that to protect water quality, to keep shading and maintain thermal continuity in the stream. They could be some fairly simple things. And there were some prescriptions that we addressed as being, if you will, I won't say window dressing, but almost window dressing. Things like putting up bird perches and bird houses. They're visible wildlife management projects, but they require some level of maintenance by people. And are they providing, true habitat? Oh, it's debatable, but they provide some value, some measurable value. If birds will occupy a birdhouse, then it's providing a value. If raptors are using perches to hunt, then they're providing a value. Smaller management projects could be things like, certainly the local seed sources for plantings underneath the panels. Softening edges in cases where we didn't have any cases where they had to clear forest, but it was something that we did discuss. And in clearing forests, cutting a hard edge within the core of a forest patch is not a good thing for the forest or the area that you're clearing either, because you increase risk of wind throw very quickly that way. So creating softer edges by replanting the edge with shrubs and kind of lowering your structural levels of vegetation as you move away from the forest into where the center where the solar array is located is a bit more beneficial. It protects the soil, it protects the trees from wind throw, it creates greater habitat diversity around the perimeter, both structural diversity and biodiversity. So from a wildlife standpoint, it's a far more appealing place to a larger array of wildlife, or larger selection of wildlife. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Heidi, did you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Michael. I was curious, like, it seems like the tool that you've created is after these places and sightings have already taken place. Do you know of any tools that are used to kind of assess siting before the solar energy implementation, before the project is underway, like using variables to pick sites in advance in the planning phase for some of these?
That's actually one of the things we're hoping to put into SEET Mark III with the grant money that we're pursuing. I mean, I can tell you, I work with a number of different solar companies in selecting sites. And so we do, fairly extensive environmental due diligence looking at sites to see whether or not there's standard wetlands and rare, threatened, and endangered species and cultural resources and things like that. But I also try to steer solar companies away from forested sites. I think it's utterly ridiculous to cut down trees to put up solar panels. But we also need to look at things like screening, because visual impacts of solar arrays are a very, very serious community concern. And therefore they're a very high level impact that can stop a project dead in its tracks. I saw several years ago, I saw one solar company lose 3 solar sites in one town in one public meeting, when the public came out and expressed a great deal of concern about the visual impacts. And the solar company kept ignoring the fact that that was the issue. They kept glossing over it and talking about what a wonderful thing this was for the community and what a wonderful thing it was for the environment. And they were absolutely deaf to the community's concerns. And you can't do that. So that's one of the things we want to incorporate into the model moving forward. We were in the development over the past year, we were basically handed 3 sites that had already been selected for development. They hadn't been developed yet, but they were selected for development. And we said, well, let's look at these sites and see what the options might be to maintain ecosystem services. But stay tuned, and we'll come back and do this presentation again, at Mark 3, and I can tell you all about the site selection criteria we've come up with.
Thank you. Yeah.
So Michael, I got a question, 2 questions actually. First of all, how receptive are you finding the solar companies to be to these sorts of procedures, these approaches to it? And second of all, well, answer that question first. It might actually end up answering my second question.
Sure. So, we started out working with one company, EDPR, and initially we had, we decided when we first developed the tool, we were going to recommend everything from soup to nuts, and we weren't going to confine ourselves to inside the fence of a solar array. And EDPR came back to us and said, we love the fact that you're this enthusiastic, but realistically speaking, we do have to keep our management within the fence. That's the area we have permission to work in. And that's a reasonable constraint. They, if they can't control things beyond the fence, then they can't. So we limited it to that. And then they said, well, keep in mind too, that our business is in producing energy to make money. And so for all of the different prescriptions, we have to consider what the costs are and whether or not those can be fitted into a budget. And so we had to massage some of these plans and adjust some of the expectations and adjust some of the recommendations to make the projects affordable. And that's where we really incorporated the benefit cost analysis, so that we could look at that up front and be able to say, well, okay, it would be great if we could create, let's create new wetlands around the perimeter. Let's use stormwater ponds and create wetlands, or things like that. But that can be a very expensive process. And if it's going to cut in too significantly to the budget of operations, then it becomes unrealistic and it won't be maintained long term, which means it won't do the things it was supposed to do. So, but however, I will say that we're talking with other firms now, and we've got 3 or 4 other development firms, some of them quite large, that have seen the plans and the tool that we've developed so far, and are jumping on board to assist with development of Mark III. And so they're very excited about it. They think this is a great idea. And in part, I think that's because the intent of it is, of course, to simplify this development overall. But it's also to help ease the regulatory burden. Regulatory agencies right now really, some of them have, quite frankly, thrown their hands up in the air because they don't know what to do about the environmental impacts of solar development. Everybody wants solar development because it's carbon neutral, but the real estate issue, the landscape area issue, is a huge one, especially for natural resource agencies. And so this, we hope, will help to make it easier for development companies to get through the regulatory process and to demonstrate that solar development can have significant environmental benefits beyond carbon abatement.
So you did end up touching a little bit on my second question. That's how are you guys going to promote this with other companies? It sounds like others are already starting to jump on board, but are there going to be any focused efforts to try to get this out to a wider audience?
Well, at the moment, we're still developing the product, and trying to improve it and make it, good, if not perfect. Perfect is usually not achievable, but we do our best. But we want to make it good, and most importantly, we need to make it practicable. It has to be able to be accepted not only by the developers, but it needs to be accepted by the regulators, and it needs to be accepted by the host communities. We'd like host communities to get involved and say, yeah, this looks like a good idea. We'd like to see solar, if a solar company wants to come here and develop an array, these are the kinds of things we want to see them doing so that they're, reflective of what our community is. So I think it's important for all of those. Once we develop a product that gets to that level, yeah, we'll probably write a Broadway show or something and publicize it that way, or certainly take it out to conferences and just networking it.
Thanks. Isabel, did you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Michael. Thanks so much. This is really interesting and exciting stuff.
Thank you.
So my question is, so when we talk about creating wildlife habitat on these solar arrays, and particularly when it comes to birds, is there any concern about these arrays becoming ecological traps due to mortality from collisions or solar flux?
That's certainly always a concern. We don't want to create any kind of hazard. So yeah, we're conscious of that. That solar flux with, as far as excuse me, birds colliding with the panels is less of a concern now than it once was, and that's because of improved technology. Most of the panels that are constructed today have less than a 2% reflectivity, so they don't tend to resemble water bodies, for example. There used to be a terrible problem with waterfowl coming and crashing down onto panels because they thought they were ponds and breaking legs or something, things like that. That's certainly anecdotal, if not reported. But so yeah, we're conscientious of that. Birds is a really tough issue with solar panels because ideally we would love to have birds using the solar fields, but birds that use solar fields also poop all over the panels. And one bird pooping on a panel can reduce that panel's efficiency measurably, believe it or not. When they're monitoring the panels, they can actually see the efficiency of a panel drop when one bird poops on it. So it makes a difference. And so the question is, do we want to encourage birds or certain types of birds within the panel arrays? Or do we need to even start looking at things like, are there different types of collectors other than flat panels that need to be developed? And I mean, there's certainly other things that have been developed. I'm not an expert in solar technology at all, but there's different types of wind turbines, for example. The big ones with the giant blades are currently the most cost-effective and efficient ones, so those are the ones that get used. But as others are developed and can demonstrate good efficiency, we may come up with different wind technology just as much as we might come up with some different solar technology that avoids a lot of those problems and opens up those fields to bird use again. I do tons of bird work. I'm currently contracted to monitor a bird mitigation site for a solar site for 20 years. And we're going to look at, how does bird use around the site and how we're managing around the perimeter of the site. This is where they are managing off-site because there are threatened and endangered grassland birds in the area.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Do we have any other questions? I'm not seeing any hands raised. Okay. Well, I want to take a moment just to thank Michael for his time today. Absolutely fascinating webinar. I'm so glad that you agreed to present to us. Karen's clapping, so am I. A lot of people are clapping.
Thank you all.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Michael. We really appreciate it. We appreciate all the help you've given to the Renewable Energy Working Group as well on the wildlife professional. And Michael's a great resource, folks. So if you, I don't know, Michael, if you're willing to put your contact information in the chat box or something.
Yes, I can do that. And
It's
also,
right
I don't
there
know,
too. Yeah, it's on the screen as well.
it's on the screen. You can feel free to email me at that address.
Yeah.
Reach out to me if you have any questions about this project. And I'll throw an ad out for Edgewood Environmental, just, birds and bats and bugs, bunnies, whatever, we do all of it. So feel free to give me a call.
And just to
or an email.
clarify, Isabel, you don't have another question, do you? Is your hand still raised?
Whoops, sorry. Yep,
Okay,
I'm
yeah.
good.
Okay. So I did want to just take a moment to make a couple of quick announcements for people on the webinar right now. I'll put these in the chat box.
You're muted, Susan.
Thank you, Michael. I wanted to make just a couple quick announcements. First of all, next week, the Renewable Energy Working Group will be hosting its quarterly members meeting next Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern. It's March 31st. We're going to have another one of our working group members, Alicia Emerson, who's up in the Pacific Northwest, talking to us a little bit about marine energy, which is something we don't get a chance to really hear a lot about. So I'm hoping all you guys will attend that. And then also next month, the Renewable Energy Working Group will be hosting another webinar on April 26th at 4 p.m. Eastern. And it's going to be presented by Rob Deal, who will be talking about the response of birds in flight to utility scale photovoltaic facilities. So you should be getting, if you're a Renewable Energy Working Group member, which I think everybody on the call is, you should be getting email announcements from our working group about that. But feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions about those. We're really trying to get as many people on these webinars as possible, and it's great to see so many people today. So thank you for attending. And with that, hopefully we'll see many of you guys next Thursday. And thank you again, Michael. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.
All right, take care, folks.